Well, we're in the book of Daniel. And I think for many of us, the book of Daniel is a favorite for lots of reasons. It's very readable, a dramatic read in and of its own right. It's just one of the most fantastic careers on the planet Earth. He not only rose to power from being a captive to being virtually prime minister of the ruling world empire at that time, but when it gets taken over by the subsequent empire, he rises to power equivalently in the succeeding empire. So he's an incredible guy. Very faithful. He and his friends go to, their exploits are legendary. In fact, it's interesting, we'll see that in our study tonight, how many phrases we use in our everyday speech that derive from this study. Your number's up. You've been found wanting, you know. The handwriting on the wall. The idol has clay feet. All these phrases you take for granted derive from this interesting story of Daniel. Another thing that I often get asked, because there's so much controversy about hidden messages in the Bible, and our text, Cosmic Codes, is emerging apparently as one of the definitive texts in this subject area. But do people say, gee, are there really hidden messages in the Bible? Absolutely. In fact, the first record of a cryptologist is our friend Daniel. We're going to encounter that in this interesting chapter that we're jumping into. Daniel's a very readable book. It's also an exciting book because it's one of the few places in the Bible where the focus of the prophecies involved are on Gentiles. And so we're going to be in Daniel chapter 5, which deals with the fall of Babylon. This fabled city that was the capital of the first world dictator, Nimrod, and emerges as a major power after the Egypt-Assyrian empires, the Babylonian Empire. And many of your Bible helps are misleading. It's astonishing to me to realize how many Bible dictionaries, Bible handbooks, and other general purpose helps confuse the fall of Babylon with the doom of Babylon. And one of the things you need to determine for your own selves is to distinguish between those two if they're not the same thing. And you'll find out why I believe they're very distinctly different. The fall of Babylon we're going to look at, and next session, we're going to devote 2 sessions. You see, we'll use this session's on chapter 5. The next session, we're going to focus on a flip side of this a bit. So, fall of Babylon, chapter 5, that's our subject for tonight. Now, you recall, the book of Daniel has 12 chapters. First 6 are narrative or historical. The last 6 are visions, and they're not necessarily in chronological order exactly. Chapter 1, Daniel and his 3 friends are deported as teenagers. They're in the royal line. They're taken as hostages to assure the loyalty of a vassal king that Nebuchadnezzar puts in place. During that siege, he finds out his father's died. He's not king of Babylon, so he goes home to take over the throne, and he has a very disturbing dream. And he uses that dream to qualify, to prove to himself that his advisors couldn't cut it, but Daniel could. So you know this fabulous story of the famous dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, subsequent to that, probably a decade or 2 later, he gets on an ego trip, probably fanned by the rivals that were upstaged by Daniel and his 3 friends, in the situation where they either bow before this idol that Nebuchadnezzar creates, or they burn. And they refuse to bow, and you know the story. We have the famous fiery furnace scene that we looked at then. Then we have this interesting chapter in Daniel that Nebuchadnezzar personally wrote. When you read chapter 4, many people miss that. It's an affidavit by the king of the world at that time. And he talks about the painful lesson in pride, where he was, because of his pride, subjected to mental derangement for 7 years. But his throne wasn't taken away. He got it back at the end of 7 years. And we have from extra biblical sources, namely the Talmud and others, that his care, while he convalesced, was given to him. I think those two had a very interesting relationship. But anyway, we're at chapter 5, the fall of Babylon. Next time we'll talk about the lion's den, that famous scene. But the main point I'm bringing up here, these chapters from 2 through 6, and also the first of the prophecy chapters, chapter 7, the last 6 through 12, are the visions. But chapter 2 through 7 is written not in Hebrew, but in the Gentile language of that day, because they focus on Gentiledom, if you will. And that gives us a great deal of fascination, because God lays out more than once, several times, all of world history, from Babylon to the Antichrist. And we will have a lot of interest in that for lots of reasons. So that's a quick snapshot. We're focusing on chapter 5 tonight, the fall of Babylon. Now, the fall of Babylon is not to be confused with the doom of Babylon, which we'll talk about next time, which is prophesied in Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 15 and 51, and Revelation 17 and 18. And your assignment for next time is to read those 6 chapters at one sitting. There are 3 pairs. And I want you to jot them down, Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 15 and 51, and Revelation 17 and 18. And what I'd like you to do, find about 40 minutes of uninterrupted time, and sit down and read those 6 chapters at one sitting. I want you to do that so the idioms and the phrases are fresh in your mind, and you will experience for yourself an opinion as to whether or not they're all talking about the same thing. I think you'll find the integration there rather surprising, and the specific specifications in those prophecies are going to be the subject of our discussion next time. And we'll talk about that in Babylon today and tomorrow. Most important city in Iraq, rarely shows up in the news, but is going to emerge to be a very prominent factor on the world scene, if we are in the period of time that I think we are. And there's a way to test it, we'll see. Now, the kings of the Babylon Empire, of course, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of a city-state that's a pawn of Assyrian politics, but he had a very sharp son by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who was general of the army and ultimately defeats all the major forces in that area, climaxing in the Battle of Carchemish, where he defeats Pharaoh Necho, and he makes Babylon the primary power in that area. But when his father dies, he ends up being king. And he has 2 sons and 2 daughters. When Nebuchadnezzar passes away, which he has by the time we get to chapter 5, Evil Merodach took over, and he lasted just 2 years. And then Nebuchadnezzar lasted for a while, and then his son took over for a couple of months. This was a rough palace. These guys get murdered and whatever. But then Nabonidus takes over. But Nabonidus, it's very interesting if you read secular history, because for many, many years, historians made fun of the book of Daniel, because their records showed that the guy that was in charge, the king of Babylon, when Babylon fell to the Persians, was Nabonidus. They knew nothing about this guy Belshazzar that Daniel talks about. But some discoveries in the archaeological discoveries in the 19th century revealed a surprising discovery, that Nabonidus was technically king, but he didn't like being king, and the people didn't like him, and the priests didn't like him. So he spent his time down in northern Arabia on other intrigues, left his son Belshazzar in charge. And Belshazzar was in charge when the Persians took over. And it not only validates Daniel, it proved that Daniel had to be an eyewitness because of the details that are there. So Nebuchadnezzar's successors are Evil Merodach, I mentioned him, he only ruled for a couple of years. Then his son-in-law ruled for a brief while, then Marduk for just 9 months until they knocked him off, then Nabonidus. But he had sent himself to northern Arabia, and his son Belshazzar, who's technically a grandson because of the intermarriage of Nebuchadnezzar, is the guy that's in charge during Daniel 5. And Nabonidus led his army into northern Arabia, and even not only the people, he was unpopular with the people, but not only that, the priests of Marduk, which was the principal Babylonian deity, became alienated with him. So he was not popular at home, he didn't want to be home, so technically he's king, but he's out of the picture. And the fact that this was well known allowed Cyrus the Great a pretext for invading the lowlands, which of course he does, and we'll get into that. For some reasons that'll be clear, I usually, when I'm giving these studies in Daniel, I've usually found an excuse by now to tell you a little story, an apocryphal story, about Lord Nelson. And you'll see why I want to work this in here, because Lord Nelson was, of course, very idolized by naval people in general, certainly the Brits. But he was on the ship, apparently, and the midshipman comes in and says, Lord Nelson, there is a French ship off the starboard bow. He says, sound general quarters, give me my red waistcoat. So he sounds general quarters, he gets on his red waistcoat, and they engage the French ship and sink it, and it was a good day. A few days later, midshipman comes in and says, Lord Nelson, there are 2 French ships off the starboard quarter. Sound general quarters, give me a red waistcoat. So again, they sound general quarters, he puts on his red waistcoat, they engage these 2 French ships and sink them. And midshipman comes in the next morning and says, Lord Nelson, sir, request permission to ask a question. He says, granted, son, that's the way you learn. He says, I notice every time we go into general quarters, you always wear your red waistcoat. Why is that, sir? So, well, that's a good question. So you see, in case I should sustain a hit during the battle, I don't want the crew distracted or dismayed because of the loss of sight of blood. So the kid nodded knowingly. That was interesting. A few days later, he comes in and he says, Lord Nelson, Napoleon's entire fleet is on the horizon. He said, sound general quarters, give me my brown breeches. I used to tell that story. It was a Spanish Armada, and it was obvious after thinking about it that I was really anachronistic. You know, Lord Nelson was, of course. Anyway, but you may wonder, what's that got to do with Daniel 5? And I'll show you, it's my way of explaining to you a fulfillment of prophecy, which we'll get here in a minute. But let's jump in at Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king. Now, by the way, don't confuse Belshazzar with Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar was the Babylonian name they gave Daniel. When they renamed Daniel's 3 friends with Babylonian names, you may recall Daniel's name was Belteshazzar. It's interesting that in Nebuchadnezzar's chapter 4, he refers to him as Daniel, which is surprising. He's using his Hebrew name. He explains whose name was also Belteshazzar, so that people who didn't know that would realize who he's talking about. Daniel apparently was in the role of some kind of prime minister type guy. But don't confuse it with Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar's died. There have been several kings in the meantime for relatively short reigns. Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, is now in charge. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. But to get the picture here, you need to understand, in the meantime, the Persian army was on the move. The Persian army had conquered many of the small lowland villages that are near Babylon. What they should have been doing is defending themselves, except this is an expression of pride. Babylon, for lots of reasons, was considered by the experts in that day as impregnable. I'll show you why they felt that way in a minute. But here, instead of defending, he's throwing a party. A non-trivial party. You're talking 1,000 lords in revelry. The room that they did it in has been rebuilt. This room has been certified by archaeologists and has been rebuilt, by the way. Interesting room. We'll talk about that more later. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, made a big mistake. It's already making a mistake. He made a military mistake by not preparing, but now he's going to make a spiritual mistake. He tasted the wine. He commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels, which his father, I should say grandfather. They don't have a word in Aramaic or Hebrew for grandfather. That's a term we use in English. When they say father, that means like a forebear. Father can be several generations prior. Father, you follow me? So the word father here doesn't mean immediate father. In fact, it means in this sense like what we would translate grandfather. Which is grandfather. Nebuchadnezzar taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. In other words, 7 years ago, Nebuchadnezzar took these vessels out of the temple on the first siege. And they're now in the museum across the road. And what he does is go to the museum and get these sacred vessels, and let's use them for our party. Bad mistake. He commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Bad move. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines, drank in them. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and iron and wood and of stone. So this is pagan revelry, desecrating these sacred vessels. Now to get a picture of Babylon, it had a double wall. This is a sketch of Babylon. And if you look at Babylon proper, you'll notice the river Euphrates, by the way, feeds not the city for water during a siege, but it also feeds the moat that protects the wall and the moat between two walls. If you zero in on that, this is the quick picture of Babylon proper, and there is a processional way that was the main celebration place. The Tower of Babel is still got remnants there. The Temple of Marduk is the current big thing. And then the palace in which this is all going on is there on the north side. And so the question many people ask me, are there hidden codes in the Bible? Absolutely. And here's one that's quite express. And Proverbs 25:2 tells us, and it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, and the honor of kings to search out a matter. And there are many different kinds of codes in the Bible. Several dozen different kinds. All the controversies surrounds a thing called the equidistant letter sequences. I'll leave that, that's another subject tonight. But you need, aside from that, there's dozens of other codes, and we're going to see one here tonight. While they're having this big party, get the picture. You know, Hollywood could have a field day, you know, staging this thing. Can you picture 1,000 lords drinking and reveling, and then in that same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand on the wall. I assume they were probably it wasn't necessarily natural, it's probably very large, who knows, but suddenly this hand, fingers of a man's hand, is writing on the wall. And that was, you can imagine, brought the party to a screeching halt. The same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over it against the candlestick, or lampstand actually, upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So apparently it was just a hand. No arm, just there's a hand, right? A finger writing on the wall. Can you imagine the reactions? I mean, you know, terror is probably inadequate to. In fact, I love verse 6. You know, a lot of people like modern translations. I don't think you can improve on the King James English here. Then the king's countenance was changed, I can imagine, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. I don't know how to make it more graphic than that. Can you picture Belshazzar here? Now, see, the problem, one reason I worked that silly little story in before I get to this point in my Bible studies is because when I tell you the joints of his loins were loosed, you have no idea what that means. But if I tell you that Belshazzar asked for his brown breeches, you immediately understand what I mean. And if you think that's funny, you haven't even half of it. Because God prophesied that to Cyrus in a letter he wrote 150 years before Cyrus was born. We'll get there. It's a fulfillment of prophecy, believe it or not. The king cried aloud to bring in the brown bridge. No, to bring in. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now that's an interesting phrase. Not the second ruler. He's the second ruler. There's a clue right there. Third ruler of the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation. That's a mystery. Why couldn't they read it? Well, and Daniel could. So there's several conjectures about this. And I'm going to suggest that Daniel is one of the first cryptologists, because he interpreted the handwriting on the wall. Then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. The party's over. They're all shook. They don't know what's going on here. Now the queen. Now this one says the queen here. This is not, I believe, Belshazzar's wife. This is the queen mother. This is the gal that was married to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's passed away. Queen mother's there, still in a place of honor. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. She apparently was not part of this party. That's to her credit. But when she hears this, she comes, makes an appearance. I suspect that was with great ceremony, because here she is. She's part of the old guard. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. That's a standard type of greeting. Let not thy heart thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, actually grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, is found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Boy, there's a lot here, just by way of summary, of course. She is recounting something that happened that Belshazzar would only have heard about. It was probably too small or not even around when Daniel had his big day. Daniel apparently has been in retirement, just like she's apparently in retirement. So he has a reputation she's obviously very, very aware of. Whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, funny she says that twice, we'll come back to that, made master of the magicians, astrologers. Notice, in chapter 2, when Daniel interpreted that dream, many people miss the fact he then was put in charge. And that's why those guys took advantage of his absence to try to frame his three buddies in the fiery furnace thing that we talked about previously. Well, she continues, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and the showing of hard sentences and the dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. That's quite a remarkable statement for this guy. Is she basing that statement on just his reputation? Possibly. Or is she making that statement because she may also have the Spirit of God in her? I don't know. But she makes a prediction here before the fact that he will show the interpretation. For some reason, she's got confidence that if they call Daniel, he'll solve their problem for them. And of course they do that. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee. I have even heard of thee. I like that. That the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation of it, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. So he's giving Daniel a quick snapshot here what the situation is. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. That's quite an offer. Daniel wants no part of it. That's neither here nor there. From Belshazzar's point of view, that's as much as he's giving as much as he would be allowed to. Some ornaments, of course, but also a position to be running things. So that's quite a challenge. He would, at least from his point of view. Daniel is fun. You know, when you see him grandstand in Daniel 2, even as a young man, he really grandstands that so beautifully in chapter 2. Well, he, at this point, has no reason to tiptoe. His reputation established, well established anyway, and he also really has a perspective thing. So then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself. The Messler translation is up yours, O king, see. And give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. But now before he does, he's going to obviously address the writing and interpret it for us. But I want you to notice what he does first. He gives a little speech. And this is not the kind of speech that you'd expect, say, an election rhetoric kind of thing. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, majesty, glory, and honor. He's going to give a little speech here. Hey, punk, your dad, now he was a real king. That's sort of the flavor of this thing. Not you. You know, put whatever demeaning term you want there. But now your grandfather, there was a king. And he's going to go through this. O thou king, thou most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and a majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew. And whom he would be kept alive. And whom he would be he kept alive. And whom he would, he set up. and whom he would, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. He's going to summarize chapter 4 for us here that we just got through. And he was driven from the sons of men. And his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. Thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee. And thou and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver, gold, and brass, and iron, and wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Many, many tekel upharsin. So that was what was written on the wall. And this is the interpretation of the thing. Many, which means numbers. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, which means weighing. Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And there's a pun there I'll come back to. There's a lot of speculations as to what was actually written on the wall. Using the old Hebrew, it might have looked something like this. There are two different presumptions among rabbis. The Talmud assumes that it was written vertically and backwards. Now this is written from right to left, which is forward in Hebrew, but I wrote it this way because you and I, to us, it seems backwards, so it would be sort of equivalent. There are other traditions, rabbinical traditions, that it was encrypted in a form of encryption called atbash. There are two kinds of Hebrew, at least, two kinds of Hebrew encryptions in the Bible. One is called albam, and it's a transposition. Now, a transposition, if you take the Hebrew alphabet and take the second half of that alphabet, fold it under the first half, you now have this very simple transposition. Instead of an aleph, use the number that's below it, the lamma. If you want a lamma, use the aleph. You exchange what letter you're using in your plain text to get your ciphertext. Your ciphertext would be, you make up the ciphertext by transposing the letters. You follow me? That's a simple transposition. And it's called albam because the aleph takes the lamma and the bet takes the mem. So those four letters define it, so to speak. So it goes by the name albam. But it's basically a simple transposition where you shift it over. There's another approach. That's to take the alphabet and take the second half and put it backwards under the first. That's called atbash. And albam is used in Isaiah 7, and atbash is used in Jeremiah several places in the Bible. Now, if you were a student in Langley, Virginia, studying cryptography or whatever, these are considered, well, they're well known, they're considered historical oddities. The fact that these encryption techniques are in the Old Testament is a simple, is looked at as just a historical note, so to speak. But if you have the insight to realize that the Old Testament was God-inspired, then the fact that there are encryptions in there has staggering implications. That the Holy Spirit has a purpose for these, and that causes, and they are what a rabbi would call a remez, a hint of something deeper. But in any case, they call this form of encryption atbash because the aleph and the tau and the bet and the shin. So atbash, you take the first four letters, and that's what gives it its label. But if you assume that the writing on the wall was an atbash encryption, then what was probably written on the wall looked something like this. And what Daniel was skilled in doing was, of course, making the transpositions to get the many, many tekel perez. The first word is many, means number, reckoned. And he interprets it, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it the way we would say it, your number is up. The word tekel means weighed. Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. The word perez means broken and divided. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now you'll notice in these letters, they're just the Aramaic is like the Hebrew. You have only consonants, no vowels. You infer the vowels. Perez, if you imply an A rather than E sound, is the word for Persians. So the word Perez means your kingdom is divided